Let's talk about Chapter 24 on HTTP requests and Chapter 25 on forms. HTTP is a protocol for moving data across the web. We're going to talk about the basics of internet, how it works, and what requests look like, what responses look like, and how we might go about viewing what those requests are in the browser using the developer tools. So on the internet, we have clients and we have servers. The client is some sort of resource that the user has, like a browser or an application. It's just some sort of interface where we can request data, interact with it, and all of that is happening, in a front-facing side. The server is on the back end. This is what actually provides the data when it's requested and gives a response. So you can imagine we've got some server out there, and it doesn't matter what the device is, this information is flowing back and forth as these requests are made, and the user is interacting with it on the device on the front end. And we tend to think of this as happening on two different locations, right? It could be anywhere in the world. People are interacting, and that happens every day. But when you are developing something, you're usually just working on your local machine, which means these requests are being sent back and forth on your machine, but they're not necessarily actually going anywhere else. So just keep that in mind. And we say there's no place like home because even your own computer has its own IP address, 127.0.0.1. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the protocols involved with moving data around. So hypertext transfer protocol, that's HTTP, that's used for sending common data from the HTML that loads on the page or images, or maybe it's even just some plain text. There can be lots of different things that are sent. If it has an S on the end, that means it's using a secure connection. There's also other protocols like TCP/IP for very small packets of information that are being sent. And then there's the domain name system, which keeps track of domain names that are associated with numerical IP addresses. So there's all these IP addresses out there running in the background. LaunchCodes is 104.25.127.113. But of course, we don't use that. We use www.launchcode.org, and it makes it much easier for us to find what we're looking for. Now, you probably know what a URL is. It's just another name for a web address, right? But there are different parts of it. And so it's helpful to know how to break this down if you're going to do web development. There's the scheme, the host, the port, the path, and the query string. And only the scheme and the host are required. Sometimes that's all you're really dealing with. But whatever parts are in there, they always go in this specific order from left to right: scheme, host, port, path, and query string. So let's break it down. I caught a couple of different examples here that have different parts. In both of these cases, this is the scheme, either HTTP or HTTPS. Then you have the host. So in the top example, we have like a website out there, some abcwebsite.org. Down here, we have localhost. This is what you have when you're developing on your local machine. In this case, I also am actually serving this application to a specific port on my local machine. So there's a port. And then you can have a path. In this case, it might be like, let's go to /products and, have a whole bunch of things that can happen at /products. And then on this one, maybe it's just a file. I'm just saying, okay, just bring up the index.html file at that location. If you have paths like this, it's possible that you can also have query parameters. So this is a query string where you start with a question mark, and then you have a series of key value pairs like ID equals, 12,352. And if you had additional ones, you would see an ampersand and then have another key value pair and have another key value pair. Anything with that, starting with that question mark after that is a query string. Let's look at requests. So on the client side, that's just where the user is interacting. It sends a request, right? Often in the browser. It's made up of multiple parts. So you'll have some sort of method, you'll have a path, and you'll have what version of HTTP it is. Then you'll also have request headers, and these are usually key value pairs. We'll look at some more of those in a second. Then you've got the body. We also call this a payload. And usually after you have your headers, below that you'll have a blank line and then the body of the request. And you can look at any of these in the Network tab in Browser DevTools. We're going to do that in just a minute. So some of the methods that you might have involved with a request could be GET for retrieving information. This would be like you're loading a page for the first time or reloading a page. Maybe you're fetching data and images to display on that page. There can be lots of things that you go get and retrieve. Post is a method for sending information to create new data on a server. So, for example, you're submitting a form. It's got information that needs to be saved to a database. Maybe you're sending an email. Those are posts. Put is for updating existing information on a server. So you've already got something in the database, you just need to update it. Patch is making like a very small partial update. Otherwise, it's very similar to put. And then delete is for removing data from the server. You're saying, hey, can you go take that out of the database? And there are others, but these 5 are the ones you'll probably see the most. In Unit 2, we're going to discuss something called CRUD operations. Create, read, update, and delete, and those correspond to these request methods. So get is the same thing as read, and post is the same thing as create. Put and patch would be updating, and of course, deleting is deleting. So keep that in mind. When we get to the point where we're working with databases, you'll be putting these two things together of actually doing operations on your database that correspond to these request methods. There are some common headers. You might see things like host, the domain name or IP address where the request is being sent. User agent would be information about the client itself, like whatever version your browser is or something like that in your machine. Accept will be what kind of data are we looking for when we get a response? What are we looking for? Content type would be, here's the data we're actually sending you, which typically is going to be with post requests, because with that type of request, you actually do need to send some information to the database or to the backend for some reason. And then you have to specify what type it is. So maybe it's JSON or it's XML. That's where you would put that information. So that's kind of the overview of requests. That's what happens when the browser reaches out for information. But what happens when the server responds to that request? A response also has several parts. You'll have a status line with some sort of code. So in this example, we see, HTTP/2.0, 200 OK, that's the code. And then you have response headers, key value pairs, and a response body after the blank line. Again, that's also known as a payload. And in this case, it looks like, we were requesting HTML and we got some HTML back in that response. And you'll also be able to view the contents of this on the Network tab in the DevTools, which I'll show you in a minute. So some of the response codes that you might see are going to be categorized in one of 5 different general areas. Anything starting with a 100 is informational. It just says, hey, we got your request. And maybe it's just an initial response while it's still processing it. A 200 response means successful. We were able to process your request and respond. 300 usually has to do with redirection. Like you made this request to us at this location, but we're actually going to send you elsewhere. 400 is a client error. If there's any sort of issue with the request on the front end, you'll get a 400 response. It says something needs to be done differently in order to get through to the back end. 500 usually means there's a server error. So you might have made a request and the server received it, but then they had some sort of an issue on their end and could not fulfill it and get that response back properly. So here's some common codes that you might see that are in these categories. 200 for OK, 301 for redirect, 404 not found. We've all come into that one, I'm sure. 500 server error, and there's so many more. There's even this prank code. It's called 418 I'm a teapot that somebody came up with at some point. And a lot of people will use it. Like if they just don't want to allow a request for some reason, they'll throw that one out, which is pretty silly. But you find these kinds of things out there. When the web was young, it was the wild, wild west. People were doing all sorts of things. All right, so response headers, some of the common ones. Content type, what type of data is going to be in the response body. the length of the response body, the location that the client should go if there's some sort of relocation that they're, sending them to, lots of different things. So let's take a look at what it's like to actually view these requests coming and going in the browser. If I pull up launchcode.org and get the website, there's a lot going on here, right? We've got all sorts of things, videos, we've got this little thing down here with all these logos from different supporters, and of course, lots of links and things. So if I open up my developer tools, I'm on the Elements tab right now, and you can see there's a lot going on here, right? Lots of content that's on this page. And I can go over to the console, and there's some messages here about stuff that it's trying to do, behind the scenes. What I really want to look at right now is the network. And you'll see that there's nothing here, and you're like, well, there's an awful lot of content on the page. What happened? Well, that's because I opened the dev tools after the page loaded. So whenever this happens, all you have to do is reload the page and it'll start from scratch. So I can just come up here and refresh the page, and now I can see it. So you see a lot of different information here, right? So I can click on these and see information about the headers, the preview of what it is that actually came back. And yeah, that turns out is a video, right? And we have like the MasterCard logo here has been fetched. And you can also narrow things down. You can say, I just want, certain types of requests. Like this was a fetch to go get some JSON from somewhere. This is the document itself. So it shows you the basic HTML for the page that was requested in that specific document. And then, maybe there's some CSS or some JavaScript, different stuff that's happening here, images, etc. There's even fonts. Got a couple font awesome requests here. So lots of different things that are all coming together to make this page. And you can see each of these requests. So let's go back to look at all of them. Notice that there's a status column here that shows you what these codes are, right? 200, 302, that was a redirect. Down here was a 101, just a couple of informational ones, 204 here. So you can see that, and if we had a request that actually failed, we would see, something that was like in a 400 or a 500 range, depending on what the failure was. Okay, so I think that's pretty much it for now. As we get into fetching, you're going to spend a lot more time looking at things like this. But for now, just you can just know that it's here. You can play around with this on different websites if you'd like to see what's kind of coming and going. But that's good for now. Okay, now let's talk about forms. How do you accept user input on a website? We'll look at some different form elements that you can use in your HTML. Look at what labels are and actual values of the data that's being put in through these form elements. And I'm going to go through each of the input elements, the most common ones, one at a time, and then also talk about buttons and form submission. And then at the very end, I'll talk about the concept of validating user input with JavaScript. I mean, up until then, it's going to be straight HTML and stuff that's happening in the browser natively. But I also want to talk about how you actually manage things with JavaScript when you have forms and form submission and user input. So we'll get into all that, and I'll do a big example at the end of another little app, like a sample web page where we can do a little bit of all of that, have a form, update some things on the page, and then actually have the form submission and validate the user's input. Let's start at the top, talk about some form elements in general. So when you want to create a form, use the tag form to enclose the entire thing. This helps the browser know that everything between those tags is going to be handled with certain actions, and any buttons that are enclosed in there, it will apply to that form and any inputs, and kind of treat them as one unit. There are a lot of different tags you can use, like input, select, button. And typically your input field should have a label so that you can tell the user what that field is for. Some of them you can get away with not doing it depending on whether you have like a placeholder in it, like in a plain text box. But there are some that you absolutely have to have a label for, like a radio button or a checkbox. So we will look at those one at a time and kind of the nuances, the difference between each type of input. But commonly, input attributes are going to be things like type and name and value. And you will find that as you're doing styling or you're accessing things with JavaScript, you also may use classes and IDs on those inputs, just like you would on other HTML elements. So here's an example of a little form that just has a single input. I have type is number, ID is quantity input, and name is quantity. And then I've got a label that says this is for the element that has the ID of quantity input. So those things correspond. And then the label itself is quantity. So this would be one way to put together an input with a label and make sure that we've got enough information here that we can access the value from JavaScript if we want to, and also to make sure it's the right type of input. Because they'll look at inputs can look a little bit different depending on whether the type is something like a date or a number or text, right? So we'll get into the differences between those in a minute. Let's talk about labels. To apply labels to an input helps the user see what kind of information they're meant to enter. And there's kind of two different ways to do it. You can either wrap the label around the input, which automatically the browser then knows that that input and the label belongs together. Or you can assign an ID to the input and then use the attribute for on the label and give it the value of the input's ID so that it kind of, it knows to put them together. That second way will allow the user to click on the label and bring that input field into focus, which is just very useful. It makes it more user-friendly. So you see two examples here. I have a label that's being wrapped around it, and I just say username and put type equals text, name equals username, and it's just a little text field, right? In this case, I actually have done it where I've put the input first and put the label separately without wrapping it around, but I use for so that even though I have them as two separate inputs and they're not nested, it still knows to focus this particular input when I click on this label. In the case of values, while the user might be looking at a label on the page to know what it is that they're putting in, you also have to handle behind the scenes. So values are about how you identify each of the values of the fields themselves from JavaScript. If you were to go into the DOM and say, I want to create an object for an input and access its value, then that would tell you behind the scenes what that is. Now, if it's something like, text, number, or a date, it's going to be the actual value of whatever the user's entered into the field. And you can even set a default value for that. So like right here, we've got, type equals number. It's just and we set it to 1. We just want it to start at 1. So, but they can change it. And then if we access the value after that, it might be something other than 1. However, with things like radio buttons or checkboxes or selects, you can set the value on the element, and you would need to in the case of something like a radio button where, they're mutually exclusive. You give them the same name so that they're part of a group. But the values have to be unique so that no matter which one of these the user has selected, when you go to your object that represents this group and look at, object.value, it'll tell you, what the current value is, and it's going to be one of these values, and then you can check for that. We'll look at these one at a time, no worries. Let's start at the top with the text input. You can use input without a type attribute, and that just makes it default to type equals text. But it's generally better to be explicit so that you always put on there what the type is no matter what. But this will allow a user to enter text in any format. The value will be a string. It's very straightforward. You can set a default value. You can also set a placeholder. Usually that placeholder will be like a place for you to say, for example, or like this, like example Atlanta. You can use properties like min length and max length to specify how long or short the input could be and control that a little bit. And something to note is that the input tag is self-closing. So you want to just put that slash in there at the end, and then there's no closing tag separate from that. A number input is somewhat similar. You just put type equals number instead of text. But the browser will validate that it can be converted to a valid number before it will allow the form to submit. So if you tried putting something like ABC in there, it wouldn't allow it. The value has to be a string that converts to a number. Again, you can give it a default value. You can put in a placeholder. You can specify min, max, and step. Step would be the idea of maybe instead of stepping by one at a time. So you would go from 25 to 26 to 27, which is the default. You could say, I would like this to step up by tenths, 25.1, 25.2, 25.3. That would be steps. The email input, you just put type equals email on a regular input element. And it looks like a regular text field, but the browser will actually validate that it has that @ symbol in it, so that it's, making sure that you've got both the username and some sort of domain after that. The value will be a string. You can give it a default value. You can have a placeholder. The date input will provide a special input that looks really different depending on what device you're on. It can look different from like a browser to an iPhone to other types of devices. But you want to just use a regular input element and then just put type equals date and let the device and that particular browser take it from there. And it will put it in whatever format it natively does. And sometimes it'll allow invalid formats to be typed in, but it will validate before the form submission is allowed and make sure that whatever was typed in can be converted to a date. And you can see in the screenshot here, it even tells you this is the format we're looking for if you are going to type it in. But then, we're actually going to give you a nice little interface where you can just page through the different months and just, jump straight to today, or just hit that and it'll work. The value, however, this is important. The value will be in the string. It'll be a string in the format 4 Ys / 2 Ms / 2 Ds. So for example, 2023-04-14. You can give it a default value as long as you use that format. You can also specify a min and a max using that same format so that you can limit a user's input to a certain date range. The checkbox input uses input with type checkbox. And you want to make sure you add a label to make it clear what this checkbox represents. Otherwise, all you get is a checkbox and you have no idea what you're checking if you're the user. You can specify a value, but it's just going to default to on if you don't. And you can actually make it checked by default by adding the attribute checked. Now, this may be the first time you've seen an attribute like this without the value. You're used to seeing them with key value pairs, right? Type equals checkbox, name equals MMs here. If you see just this, it just means that it's a Boolean and it has a value of true or false, yes or no. And so all you have to do is put checked on it in order for it to default to it already being checked. And then when you load the page, you see something like this where these two are checked, but this third one is not. Radio inputs are similar to checkboxes, except they're mutually exclusive. You want to group them together. Set the type as radio and add a label to make sure each of them have their own label, but you need to give them all the same name. Use the name attribute and make sure everything in the group has the same name. Otherwise, you could click on multiple ones and they're not mutually exclusive anymore. And then you have to specify different values. This is important so that whenever one of them comes back as being the one from that group that has been selected, you can access that value and know which one it was. You can also add the attribute checked for this to show which one should be checked by default, just like you do with checkboxes. So in the example here, we have chocolate and vanilla as being, you can choose one or you can choose the other, but not both. And chocolate is checked by default because of course it is. Chocolate is the best. Okay. The select or drop-down input uses select. It actually does not use input. It's got its own special tag. So you use select, and then for every single option that's meant to be a part of the dropdown, you use an option element, and you just nest it inside. And so you don't need to use a label because the text is actually going to go between those option tags. And then you do need to specify a value for each option, again, because we need to know, depending on which one they selected, we have to access the value if we're trying to pull that out, either through just sending it through an HTTP request, or maybe we're pulling it out through an object in JavaScript. The very first option will be the default value. So sometimes people will just put something in there that just has a blank value and it just says something like select one or choose one. And that way it makes it so that you can actually check to see whether the user has really selected something real or not by seeing if it's an empty string as the value or whether they have in fact chosen one of the options. And that can be a good way to go, just because that way you know for sure that the user thoughtfully selected one and it didn't just default to the first one, and maybe that's not what they didn't mean to do, but they accidentally skipped over it or whatever. Okay, so those are all very common input types, and I know I went through them kind of fast, but there's so many resources online for looking up this stuff. What I really would like to focus on is how the form functions when you use things all together, and of course get to the part where we're actually interacting with JavaScript, which is the really important part. So let's just talk quickly about buttons and form submission, and then I'm going to show you a quick example of how we put it all together. You can actually use an input with type submit to create a button, and it will by default look just like a button, but it is more common to actually use a button element and just put type equals submit on that. There are other button possibilities, for example, a reset button. So you would need to make sure that both of them have a type attribute. Otherwise, the browser just assumes everything is a submit button. So in the case where you have more than one, put submit on one, put the other type on the other, like reset. And then it's very clear on what it's supposed to do with each one. Type submit behaves normally. It'll try to submit all the information and go to a next page or refresh the page. But type reset actually will just take all fields back to their default values, whatever those were. And maybe it was, like a checkbox, maybe it was checked and not necessarily blank. Just whatever it was to begin with. Okay. So if you are submitting a form via HTTP, you will actually want to use the action attribute to set what that destination URL is on that form tag. So remember, we enclose the entire form in a form tag, right? So right up there at the top, you can set the action and say, I want it to go to this page or this website or URL whenever the form is submitted. And you can also set the HTTP method. And if you don't provide an action, that browser is going to default to using the current page. And then if you don't set a method, it will default to get. But post for form submission is generally better to use because it's more secure. And you're going to have an opportunity to practice that when you do your studio. There are other things that you can do for submission, like using an event handler, like a listener with JavaScript, and gathering all of that data, packaging up a certain way, and then like sending it off to a server. That's something that you would do down the line. We're not going to be handling, working with a backend directly right now. You can just focus on working with things on the front end. Okay, so let's look at an example here where we have this page that has some of the same examples I was just showing you. You may have picked up on the fact it looked like a order form for ice cream, right? Like some sort of ice cream dessert. So we have a city, and this is a regular text input. Let's take a look at this. Yeah, we've got the city input, and it has a label here that's designated. And you'll notice when I click on the label, it highlights this. It puts it into focus when I'm clicking on these labels. That's one of the benefits of using the for attribute on the label and making it sync with this ID that's on the input. When you do put them separately and don't nest them together, this will keep them connected. Here we have a quantity input. You'll notice as soon as I click in on this, it doesn't look like a regular text input. It's actually a number input. So I can go up and down, or I can type something in. If I wanted to say, I want 100 ice cream cones, then I can do that. I can put in an email address. And if I were to try to, put something in here, like, just Carrie, and I try to submit this, it automatically is going to stop me and say, hey, you didn't put an @ in there. That can't be a valid email address. So that's one of the benefits of actually using type equals email on your input there. For the date, I just used type equals date. I didn't really make it default to anything or put any restrictions on it, but you can see that for this particular browser on my particular machine, my Mac, it looks like this. And I can, choose a different year or different thing. I can page up and down through the months. And then I can choose different days, or I can go and choose today. And it just puts it in there for me. Here we have radio buttons. I have defaulted it to chocolate, as previously mentioned. You can see that one is checked here. And I can only choose one or the other. As soon as I select this one, the other one deselects. On the other hand, checkboxes, which you see here with type checkbox, they have, these two have been checked by default, but I can check and uncheck them independently, and I can have as many or as few as I want. So let's say that I just really love sauerkraut on my ice cream. I mean, I don't know about you, but yeah, it's disgusting. I know, it's silly. Okay, so you can choose that. And because these all have their own individual values, or excuse me, their names here, I know how to actually, tell them apart. Okay, so the cone, this is a select. So again, this value right now is nothing because I have this one set to be an empty string. So I can tell that nothing real has been selected because right now the value is just an empty string if I were to check with JavaScript. But as soon as I check one of these, if I were to try to look up the value of that as an object, I would see that it has, whatever value I've assigned it here. And then we have the buttons. I have two buttons, type submit and type reset. If I try to save these selections, it takes me to order submitted, thank you. And the reason it did that is because up here at the top, I set the action to a different page, orderconf.html, which is this page right here. You can see it's just a very simple page. It just says order submitted, thank you. But that's where this action said, when the form's submitted, where should I go next? And that's what I did. On the other hand, if I were to go back and I could see, let's put in St. Louis and, Carrie@jones.com, which is not a thing. And I've, selected a few things here, right? If I clear the form, it just puts it back to its original defaults. Chocolate is selected, M&Ms and pecans are selected. This one's back to just being, an empty value. And these are all blanked out and back to the placeholders. So that's how that works. That's just everything straight from the HTML side. What I want to talk about next is what happens when we want to start using JavaScript with forms. One of the primary things that JavaScript is used with for forms is validation. Because while you can use attributes like required or min length or things like that, and the browser has some built-in validation checks, like you just saw with the email, you might have much more specific things that you're looking for. So custom validation would mean you'd want to use event handlers like listeners and actually say, when this button is clicked, let me go check this and this and this and make sure all of those things have the values I'm looking for and are going to work for what I need before I allow you to submit. And maybe that's because they have a perfectly good string, but you want to make sure it has only alphabetical characters or only, certain special characters, which, as you can imagine, is very important for things like usernames and passwords. Um, and this would definitely be preferred over using built-in attributes like required, because you can provide the user with much more specific feedback. You can throw up an alert or put up some sort of other notification on the user interface that says, hey, we need you to do this instead or whatever. There's also something really important here. Using event.prevent default, pay attention to this because it will be part of graded assignment 5. This will keep the form from submitting so that they stay on the page and fix the issue. And the reason for that is that the browser's natural behavior is that when you click a submit button, it either refreshes the page and stays where you are, or it goes to the next page wherever you sent it. It will move on regardless of whether there's issues or not. If it passes all of the built-in validation, that doesn't mean that you're not still trying to do something with your JavaScript. But if you don't put in event.prevent default, it's going to continue on anyway, and then you're no longer on that page, or the page is refreshed. So you need to give the user a chance to fix the issue. So if you use this, it will not move forward. And then, they still have their values in the forms that they filled out. They don't have to start over from scratch. And you can have messages there telling them, hey, here's what you need to fix. So keep that in mind. Event.prevent default. That's going to be an important thing. So let's put all of this together. I'd like to do a larger example for you that actually, mimics the way a page on a website would work with a more complex form. And just for fun, it's also going to have some interesting page updates, just, visually, make some updates to help the user know what they're looking at. So the idea here, and I need to switch what I'm serving with live server here. So let me get this up. Okay. So the idea here is that I am providing a form for a user to be able to customize a business card for this fictitious printing company, River City Printing Company. And we have a little preview thing for them here that we're going to be able to wire up so that it refreshes and shows, which background do they want. We're going to have different ones for them to choose from. And as we detect that they're making these changes in the form or entering things in here, if they start to enter in their name, we should be seeing those update in the preview here. So we're going to be tapping into the values of each of these inputs just for the purpose of updating them here long before we actually tap into the values for form submission. So I'm going to show you just a variety of ways that you're going to interact with these form inputs with JavaScript that will help you with some of the assignments you've got coming up. Okay. So on my HTML file, you'll see this whole form here. I've got, let's get past the header. There's just some Google Analytics and Google Fonts stuff going on up there. Okay, so I have the preview section. This is where, in this entire box here, the card background, and inside the place where all the text is, and then I've got spans for each one of these lines. We're going to be creating JavaScript objects for each of these that will allow us to change these values, update the background, and change the layout of everything. Sometimes we'll move all the text to one side or another, and sometimes we'll put it back in the center. And then, of course, actually updating the values themselves corresponding to the values that are put into the form. Then here's the form itself. You'll notice the action is just going to submitted. All I really want to do is send them over to this other page that just says, thank you, your design has been submitted. But inside the form, we have the style selection with several options, as you've seen, elegant, floral, geometric, luxe, and classic for the background options. And then we have the fields. We have a text field here for the name. We have text fields for the address and line 1 and line 2. And then we also have a little checkbox here that allows us to let them indicate that they really don't want an address line 2. They'd like to just remove it. And so we're going to wire it up so where they click on this, that line 2 disappears from the preview. And then phone number and email address will continue here. And of course, email is actually of type emails, and phone input is going to be of type tel, which means that it'll format nicely for us as a telephone number. And then the quantity and paper quality section down here is where we have the select dropdown for the quantity and the radio buttons that have regular or premium for the paper selection. Then we have a reset button and we have a submission button to save the design and submit it. And that's all down here. Okay, so that's the whole form. You're welcome to come back and look at this code later if you want to, really inspect how it is that I set each of these up. The main thing to pay attention to is, when I've set names and I've set types, and in some cases where I've set specific values for things, that becomes really important for being able to access those things and tell them apart in the JavaScript. So yeah, the radio group here has these, values of regular and premium, but the name is paper input for both so that they are part of the same group. And here, because, putting them in a div like this, nesting them in a div, that does not actually tell the browser, oh, hey, that's a group. The fact that these two have the same name is what tells them that they're mutually exclusive and they're part of a group. The div is just for styling purposes. That's just for layout. Here, this one, the values have to be different for each of the options in the select so that we know what each one represents from the code behind the scenes. So again, just pay attention to those types of things. Okay, let's get to the script, because this is really where things become, we have to make it interactive, right? So in the script, I already have created some of the objects that I need to represent this preview area up here. We've got the card background, the section that holds all of the text, and then we have the individual lines, the name line, the address 1 line, address 2 line, and the phone and email line. So we're going to be able to update style values and inner HTML values of these dynamically as the user is interacting with these fields down here. So we need to go ahead and create objects that represent the form so that we can detect events, changing as the user interacts with it. So let's create an object for the form itself. I'm just going to call it form. And all I really have to do for this one is use query selector and go for form. I don't have to have an ID on it or anything like that because it is the only form on the page. I can find it by virtue of the fact that it is a form element. That's the name of the element. So I'll use that to do that. And then I need to create objects for each of the input elements. So I might go about it like this. I'll call it style input to make it clear that this represents the input itself, the field. And go to document.getElement by ID and go get the ID that I assigned to it. And it's important that you have actually assigned it. So if I come up here to, for example, the style input, I called this entire select style input. So that's what I'm using. So I'm going to be consistent with that and do that for all of these. For the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and just paste these in. Oops, looks like I'm forgetting a C. There we go. Okay, so I now have objects for my name input for each of the address lines for the checkbox where we give them the option to omit the second line of the address, for the phone input, and for the email input. You'll notice that I didn't bother getting anything for these down here, the quantity and the paper selection. That's because for my purposes right now, I don't need either of those to update anything up here. The only ones I'm really going to be listening for changes on are going to be the ones above that. So that's why these are the ones that I actually had to create objects for at this point. I do also want an object for the reset button because I'm going to need to manually update some things about all of this whenever the reset button is pushed. Because think about this for a second. We know that the browser is going to automatically return all of the fields to their default values whenever we hit the reset button. But the browser does not know anything about our preview section up here. We're handling that with pure JavaScript. So I'm going to have to reset all of that as well at the same time. And I know it'll take care of this, but I need to take care of this myself. Okay, so we'll have a reset button, and I can go through and use query selector. And I did, in fact, give that an ID of reset button. I could have done that with get element by ID too. It doesn't matter. But there's an example of how to do it if you use query selector with an ID. Okay, so we have several things we need to do. One is to update the styling of this card preview based on the input. So by styling, I'm referring to the background. We're going to have a background image, and we're going to justify justify content so that the text will maybe go to the left, to the right, or the center. We're going to align the text itself, and also change its color potentially. For the name text, we want to change the font and the font size. So quite a few things that we'd like to do, and every single one of these options that we have for the style, if it's elegant or geometric or whatever, is going to have different values. We're going to use different fonts and everything. It's going to be pretty interesting. So the first thing we have to do is add an event listener to something, right? So that we can detect when the style has been changed. So if this style altogether, just changing one of these means updating a whole bunch of stuff up here, then this is what I need to put the event listener on, because this change is going to precipitate us, updating the view on all of this. So I will go to my style input and add an event listener for the change event. And I'm going to give it an anonymous function and say, whenever we detect a change of style, I want you to update it. But we need to actually say, well, how do we decide what to update it to? It's going to depend on what the value is, right? If it's elegant, we want it to look one way. If it's floral, we want it to look another. That means we need to be able to access these values to know which one the change just represents. So I'll start at the top. We'll say if style input dot value is elegant, and then we'll do a bunch of changes here. So when I talk about the value here, what I'm referring to is not the label. It's not what the user sees when they go here and select something. That has a capital E. And if we go back and look at our HTML, we can see that's just the label that's between the option tags. That's what the user sees. I'm talking about this value right here. It's one of the attributes that exist for each of the options in this select with this ID. So when I go to style input and I say dot value, I'm saying show me the one that's currently selected. And if it is this one, then I will update values based on that. And we're going to check it for each one of those different options. So for something like this, I can go to the card background and say, I want to change the style of the background and give it a particular image. And that value is going to be the URL images/elegant background.png, which is the location of my file here in my images folder. I have these different images. So I'm just saying, go there and set that as the background for the card background. And then we can also justify the content of all of the text, the whole block of text. So go to justify content. And in this case, no matter what it was before we chose elegant, I want it to go back to center. For the text itself, I have a typo here. Let me fix that. Card background. There we go. Okay, card text. For the card text, I would like to align the text to the center. And also for the card text, I said that I wanted to change the color. And so I've got a very specific color code I'm going to use here. 1A4362. And then I want to change the font family of the name. this is going to be one of the Google fonts that I have installed in the head of the document. I have a backup font there. Okay. And the last thing is to do the font size. And I'm going to say I want it to be 20 pixels. And the reason for that is because not all fonts are created equal. And if I want something that takes up roughly the same amount of space on the preview, I'm probably going to have to adjust the size from font to font. So these 6 things are what I'm going to change every time we change the style. So we can test this out and see what happens now that we have done this. Let's come over here and choose elegant, and boom, it updates everything. And look at that, we have a new background. Everything is centered the way it's supposed to be. And we have a new font and also new color. You can see that's kind of a navy color, right? So that's great. If I go to select other things now, nothing's happening. And that's because I don't have anything else in here yet except what to do if we do choose elegant. So I need to put the rest of them in here. And for the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and just copy and paste them. So give me a second here to grab this. And right here, I'm going to start with an else if. Okay, so now we have elegant, we have floral, which has a different image and different justification, different color, different font. I've got geometric, luxe, classic, and then something you may not have thought of is what if they change it back to no background? We actually need then to be able to change it back to that as well, right? So now we can come over here and play around with this, and we should be able to see not just elegant, but floral, geometric, luxe, and classic. And then of course, if I change it back to no background, it goes back to the way it was before. Okay. So we now have a very interesting little preview thing just in terms of the style of the card, right? What about the text? If we want to be able to actually update the content where it says your name and your address as they are typing in here, we're going to need to have some event listeners for these fields as well. So we're going to start with the name input and put in a listener on that and say, if the user starts typing, so we'll use the input event, which literally just is keystroke by keystroke. As soon as they start to type a single thing, it's going to update every single time, rather than like waiting until they typed the whole thing in and moved away from it, where it's out of focus. This will actually let us update it dynamically the entire time they're typing, which is pretty neat. So we're going to say we want the value of the name, the inner HTML of that element to actually be whatever value is coming from the input. So this is important. We're changing the name right here. Name is our object for this preview part. Name input is the actual field, and we're taking that value and assigning it as the inner HTML up here. That's what's happening. But we also have to think about the fact that what if they blank it back out and there's nothing there? So if there's no value because they've blanked it back out, then we're just going to say, set it to your name instead and put it back to what it used to be. And this little or used this way, that's shorthand with JavaScript to basically say, use this value. But if this is faulty and it actually, by virtue of being an empty string would evaluate to 0 or to false, then you actually can use this value instead. Go to this one next. Okay, so let's try it out. I'm going to start typing in a name. And look at that. As I'm typing, it's updating. You can even put, R. Jones and play around with it. And we can see it updating up there. Okay. So let's go ahead and add the same exact thing for the other ones. And for address 1 and address 2, I can do it exactly the same way. I can say, let's go to the input for that, listen for any sort of change, any sort of keystroke in there, and then just update the inner HTML of the line up here in the preview with the value from the input, or if they have blanked it back out, let's just put it back to what it originally was. And then same thing here for address 2. Then what about this checkbox? We said that we wanted to actually hide or remove even the line 2 here from the preview if they check this box, right? So we need to have a way to do that. So I'm going to say, go to admit address 2, which is this little checkbox right here. That was our object for that. And add the event listener and listen for some input, which really is just checking or unchecking, right? But that'll work. And then we just say if omit address 2 has been checked, then we want address2.style.display to be none. Now, in the past, you've seen me use visibility as a property for, making something hidden or visible. That won't work here because it'll still leave a blank line. It doesn't actually remove it from the DOM here. So if we want it to actually completely like take it out, we use display none instead. And then if we want to put it back, we say address2.style.display is block. Okay. So let's practice this. Come over here and just test it out. Yeah, you can see that it actually takes it out and just removes that line altogether as I check and uncheck it. So that is working now. Okay, we need to do the phone number and email address. Now here's the thing about this. They are on the same line. And I have one element for this. If we look over here, you can see in the preview section, I have a single span for both, which means that no matter which one of these fields is being updated, I need to update this entire line either way. So what I would like to do for this is to have a function, instead of doing 2 different identical anonymous functions with a listener on each one of these fields, we'll put a listener on each field, but let's go ahead and define one function and then just refer to it with both listeners. So I'll have a little function, update phone and email. And I'm going to say, let's set the inner HTML, there we go, of the phone to be, of the phone email line, I should say, since it's all one line. And we're going to have phone input.value. I forgot my placeholder bracket. Let me fix that. There we go. Phone input.value, or if we don't have a value, if it's an empty string, we'll say your phone. And then we'll have the pipe that is up there because you can see it's got a pipe in there between the two, right? We'll put that in and then have, again, another expression to be evaluated that says either email input has a value to be displayed, or we can display your email and put it back to the default value that we have in there to begin with. Okay. So this is going to make it flexible enough to where they can edit one or the other. It doesn't matter which order they do it in or whether they blank one of them back out. This will handle it every single time of just saying, do we have an actual value from the user for either one of these things? If we'll use that, if so, otherwise we'll have some default text to display for that part instead. It concatenates it all together with this template literal and then applies it to the inner HTML of this line up here on the preview. So now we just have to set our listeners on each of these fields and then refer to this as being the thing that it should execute whenever a change is made in one of those fields. So I'll go to phone input and put add event listener and say when there's input, update the phone and email. That's the one you should execute. And I can do the exact same thing for the email input. Okay. So let's test that out. So I'm going to come down here and start typing in a phone number. And it's updating it on the screen. And of course I can change the formatting if I'd like, whatever I'd like to do there. I can blank it out and it puts your phone back. If I put the email address in, it starts updating that and just leaves your phone there since we don't have a value here. But if I have a value here and I start to put a value here, now it's displaying exactly what we have based on both. So it's very flexible, and I can remove the email address and it puts that part back to your email. But we're just calculating it so that, no matter which one of these is being edited, it's going to just, update them together. Okay. So that's everything that needed to be handled for actually updating it based on input, detecting input. Now we need to deal with the buttons. We're either resetting or we're saving, right? So for resetting, we said that we, definitely it would be resetting these fields to what they used to be automatically because the browser handles that. But we actually want to also update the preview up here to set it back. And then the other thing is, honestly, for good user experience, we probably should just warn them, right? Use a confirmation in the window to say, hey, did you mean to hit that button? Like, are you sure you want to undo everything that you just typed in? Just in case, right? That's a nice thing. So we'll use a confirmation for that too. So all of this can be handled by putting a listener on the reset button, a click listener. If we are clicking this button, then we need to have some logic in place. So I'll go to the reset button that we defined above and say add event listener and listen for a click. And when we have one, here's what you do. First, we'll confirm before resetting. And then we will reset the content on the preview. And then we'll reset the styling on the preview because that really is two different things, right? Okay. So first, let's establish a Boolean variable should reset. And we'll set it equal to the return value that comes back from confirm and say, are you sure you want to start over? And whatever they say, we'll say, if they don't want to reset, if they say, oops, I didn't mean to do that, and they cancel, then we can say prevent default so that it won't blanket anything out. Oh, and I have to capture the event. Okay. On your listeners, make sure that if you need to interact with the event, that you actually capture it. So I can put event up here as the parameter, and now it's available to me. And I can say prevent default. There we go. Prevent default. And then I can just return and exit this function early without continuing on to anything down here. Okay, so I need to go to each of the objects for the preview content up here. So for example, name .html and just set that to its original value. This is what it was in the HTML to begin with. If we come back over here and look, you can see, they're just these values. It's just that now we have to do it with JavaScript to put them back to these values on purpose. And I'm just going to copy and paste in the rest of these. Okay, so all four of them will now just be reset to what they originally were. And then we'll do the same thing with the styling. We had a bunch of things, and we actually already have this same stuff here where we just wanted to put everything back to these values, right? As if we had chosen no style to begin with. So we can do that. But we also need to do one more thing. And that is to change the style, the display of that address to line, because just in case they had clicked that, checked that box that said, it needs to be hidden or rather removed from display, we need to put it back, and otherwise it won't automatically do it. Okay, So that should take care of it. So let's come over here and do a whole thing and test it out. We'll say geometric and say John Smith at 555 Main Street. And we'll say remove this line and then put in the phone number and John at smithcontracting.com. Sure. Change this to 500, doesn't matter, premium. Okay, now let's say I want to reset. I'll reset. Are you sure you want to start over? And if I cancel, nothing changes. Everything's still exactly how I left it because we did the prevent default so that it wouldn't blank anything out. But if I do it again, and this time I say, okay, we allow it to continue, blank out all of our fields, or at least just put them back to what their defaults were. But then our JavaScript right here, these lines of code took care of updating this preview because that had nothing to do with the browser's behavior. We had to manually set all this back. So that's it. Okay. The last thing we want to do is we're going to allow them to to submit it. And we're going to go ahead and do that based on just putting a listener on the form. And we could have, function capture the event if we need it. And for now, I'm just going to log something, form successfully submitted. Now, what's interesting about this, and I'm doing this on purpose, we're probably not really even going to get a chance to see this. And here's why. When we come over here, first of all, I have, I'm going to save this design, right? It's already warning me, hey, you haven't selected an item in the list. And that's because if we come back over here to here, we can see that I've got the required keyword, the required attribute. That actually is something that's built into the browser that just says, hey, this is required. They can't submit it without having, selected one of these that has a value other than a empty string. So they have to have selected one of these 5. And so it's telling me, select something in the list. So I can do that. Sure. Okay. And then I can try submitting it now. And it's going to keep doing that because I have required on some of these fields, right? So it's warning me. And right now I have all of this validation. I need to open up the DevTools so that you can actually see the console. Let me get back over here. Okay, so I can hit this button, save this design, and you still don't see that console log that was in the script. Let me go back to the script. Here we go. You still don't see this because this is only, this listener, the submit listener is only going to fire after it passes the built-in validation from things like this, where in the index you can see where I've got required on things. So that's an important thing to remember. Browser-based validation will always go first. And then after that, it will continue with things like listeners and whatever you put in here. So I have to fill out all of these that are required, and it should let me continue. So I'm going to just do a real quick Main Street. And then we could say like St. Louis, Missouri, 63111. Do a quick phone number, an email address, and select whatever. And then watch the console. I'm going to say save this design and submit it. I don't know if you saw that, but it was there, barely. It said form successfully submitted. But the thing is, then it followed the action on the form. If we come up to the top of the form itself in the HTML, and it went to our submitted.html page here. And because it did that, it moved on. And so that's why you're not actually really going to see much come out of anything you log at that point, because if it does submit and it goes ahead and there's no event prevent default, you're not going to see anything that you logged. So just keep that in mind. If you're ever trying to get to the bottom of something with a submit listener, if it goes through successfully, you're not really going to see anything you print. It'll be gone in a flash. Okay. So that's how that works. And if you were going to do any sort of custom validation to make sure that, say, like, let's go back to the form, to say that like maybe I had done Caroline at Jones and that passed the browser's validation, but I didn't put the .com on there, you might have to do your own logic to check that value. You would do that here. So once it passes built-in validation, then it does fire this. And then, so then here is where you would say, if this is a problem, or this is a problem, or this is a problem, then event.prevent default, and you put some sort of message in here to say, hey, you need to fix this. Those are the kinds of things that you can play around with. I don't have time to go over them right now. But when I do if you watch the studio review for the studio, you'll actually see me do an example of putting some feedback right there on the page for the user as part of the bonus missions on that studio review. Okay. So I have a practice exercise for this called This Week on my website, where it's a little kind of checklist sort of thing where you can put what day of the week you have something that needs to get done, and you can categorize it with these little labels and choose from different categories. So I have a whole little tutorial where you can go through and build this and learn how to make it functional the way that you want, and practice accessing the values and using JavaScript to update the page. And again, I have mentioned this before, but I have these prep exercises for graded assignment number 5. The first one, you do not even need to know how to use forms really to do the first one. The second and the third, you need to know how to use forms, but you also need to know how to fetch data. So that's going to be something you might want to hold off until after we've done the next lecture. But definitely, if you're going to choose one of these to do Pour Me Another first, because trivia time is much more complex. This one would be more along the lines of covering definitely everything you have in graded assignment 5, and then probably being a little bit extra, because I always make things a little bit extra. That's just the way things go with me. But yeah, so you can go ahead and check those out if you have time. They could be beneficial for you as you prepare to do graded assignment number 5. For your studio for this class, you're going to create a page that has a form that allows a user to do a search engine search, but you're actually going to allow them to choose which search engine they want. They'll put the search term into your form and then select which search engine. And then when they submit it, it should go to that search engine's website and show them the results of their search. It's a pretty cool little thing. And there are bonus missions for user input validation and adding styling, and I cover all of that in my studio review, which is also on YouTube. All right, I will leave you with that. Thanks so much. I'll see you next time.